What I want to present today is essentially one simple message, and that is that in all the discussions about security sector reform and also the discussions which we had already here in the first session, there seems to be a lot of emphasis put on what I would call the public security sector. But what I would like to highlight your attention to is that there is also a very important yet often neglected part of what is an important section of security sector, which can be called in the official language non-statutory security force institutions, of which, and this is what I want to specifically focus on, is also a sector that is so-called for-profit, that is companies that actually do security on profit-based, private security and private military companies. I also then have in the second part of the slides a presentation by a colleague of mine from the Czech Police Academy, which is more focused on the volunteering elements, that is private security on a non-profit basis. But I will not present that, but I will leave the slides for anyone who is interested with the contact to my colleague Dr. Krulik. So why the emphasis on non-state or non-public institutions? If we look at the security sector reform and all of its dimensions, I think we can summarize it with one simple overarching goal or aim, and that is that essentially we want to make sure that security is provided in accordance with the law, ideally also in line with democratic standards, as a public good. That security is something that's provided by the state or state institutions to all citizens of the states, regardless of how much money they have, what ethnicity they may be of, or what is their color of the skin, or any other such a dimension. So it is available to all citizens, and it is basically provided first by the state institutions, not necessarily for free because you have to pay taxes, but the actual provision is not charged when it comes to the consumers, that is the citizens of the states. Yet, in all countries, and this is what I want to highlight, in countries including Czech Republic, but also most countries in the world today, in all of the dimensions of the security sector, either reform or its regular functioning, that is the legal, the political, the economic, social and the institutional dimension, the private sector plays a very important role. And this is both quantitatively, because if we stay, for example, in the Czech Republic, we have more employees of private security companies than the members of both national and municipal police. We have roughly 45 public police officers, if you want to call them, in this joint label, and we have roughly 56,000 of employees of private security companies. Perhaps even more importantly, there is a qualitative dimension, and here I can perhaps also link my presentation to the previous one on personal security clearances, and this is a US-based experience. I'm sure you've all heard about the case of Eric Snowden and the famous leaks of secret information from the United States. Regardless of where you stand on whether he did a good thing or a bad thing, it's also an interesting question how come he got access to all this classified information. And the basic answer is that he was what in the US is called a private security contractor, someone who had a top security clearance in the US because he was working, his company was one of the many that was hired by the US. In that case, it was Central Intelligence Agency to work on national security issues. This raises a couple of interesting issues, both in terms of personal security clearances. There were roughly 6 million top secret private security clearances handed out in the US to these private security contractors. Because of this Snowden case, they are now revising the number and the access of the private security sector to this, but it also in a general level illustrates the importance of looking at private sector as a very important player in the security system. This of course differs by country to country. This is why I want to later highlight some what I would call best and also worst practices when it comes to private security. But again, overall, essentially private security is an important player, but it is also a problematic player because precisely it challenges the notion of security as a public good. because private security companies don't necessarily care, at least in the first line, about security. They see security as the means to their primary motive, and that is achievements of profit, as all other companies do. They also play an important role in another process which we may be now lectured in Ukraine quite frequently: disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. Again, I don't want to go into details on this because I'm sure you have plenty of other presentations on this. But this is essentially also something where the role of the private sector in many countries all over the world has been quite important, both in a negative and in a positive way. When it comes to the key challenges, that is essentially collecting the mass amounts of weapons, which unfortunately, as I could also see just walking through Kiev, probably is an issue in Ukraine, because it seems relatively easy to get access to weapons here for almost anyone who seems to be willing to get them. And then being at war, and the question then of course is, are we already moving towards the end of the war or not? But regardless of that, the private sector represents important opportunities for employment of either ex-combatants or those who may actually become combatants, also, so to speak, on the wrong side. Some examples of this I will give later, but to summarize this, and why I'm also talking about disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, and security sector reform in one piece, ideally, at least the academic literature would suggest that these should be, number one, interrelated, and then secondly, mutually reinforcing. Interrelated, that means the idea that essentially if the state is indeed to provide security as a public good to all of its citizens, you need something called the monopoly on the use of force. Actually, those of you who are studying security, there is a famous Max Weber sociological definition of a state as the only entity that legitimately claims the monopoly on the use of force. As I will try to show, this is empirically actually wrong. The state only recently, in the 19th and 20th centuries, have managed to somehow come to something close to the monopoly on the use of force. And in many countries, including Czech Republic, and I will try to show the few data that I found on Ukraine, there is this important private sector that's challenging this idea that the state has the monopoly on the use of force. On the reinforcing part, demobilization and reintegration essentially is precisely about re-establishing, to the extent possible, the state monopoly on the use of force. This I see very important also in terms of what's going on in Ukraine today. I can perhaps skip the international examples, and I was just searching for the topic on the news headlines in the recent weeks. This is what I could find on Ukraine per se, and this is why I think that this idea of re-establishing the monopoly on the use of force is something that's quite pertinent. I won't go into reading the examples that you can see in the slides, but they highlight that the private sector is here in various forms. Perhaps the one that's potentially most challenging is what some people, at least in the West, call the oligarch armies or private armies, which certainly challenge the idea that the Ukraine state is the one who is in charge of security in Ukraine. Also, we could talk about the volunteers, battalions which are currently doing the fighting in the east, but also and their reintegration. This is why the last slide that some people even in Ukraine are suggesting that their reintegration eventually will be precisely best handled in the private sector, in the form of private military companies. I will then talk about the differences between private security and private military. But just to highlight that this is something which I think is relevant in Ukraine, but also there are plenty of examples from other countries where ex-combatants have been reintegrated somehow, or were trying to be reintegrated, but at the same time this reintegration not always went well, and they were a challenge to this state monopoly on the use of force. So just very briefly, one of the most notorious examples that didn't go that well was the transition in South Africa in the 1990s after the collapse of the apartheid regime. where the problem was what to do with many of the, especially the elite units, but in general the police and the military, which was essentially white dominated, or the apartheid regime dominated. Essentially what has happened in South Africa, and this is perhaps a worst example, not something to follow, was that these units almost en masse have transformed into private military companies. The most well-known of these was Executive Outcomes, which were then doing lots of fighting in other African countries, being hired both by governments, local militias, rebel forces. I would call this an example of exporting your problem, exporting your demobilization and reintegration via private sector. Certainly not the best example to follow, because this company was accused of numerous human rights, international law and other types of violations, and contributed really to many conflicts, bloody conflicts in Africa especially. A more recent example, which is probably also not ideal to follow, but may be interesting because of the warlord experience, which some people use also the terminology oligarch experience in Afghanistan, where essentially also the local governors, the local heavy men, or the warlords commanded sometimes more powerful armies than the Afghani state, and currently many of them, because of various trends in Afghanistan, they are simply officially being re-registered or registered as private security companies, which in my opinion also challenges the future of the Afghani state and its capacity to function as a provider of security as a public good. On the other hand, we have also some more positive examples from post-conflict processes, especially in Africa and in Latin America, where really the ex-combatants, usually in post-conflict settings, but sometimes also settings post-authoritarian regimes, for example in Chile, where they have been reintegrated or found employment in the private sector. So this idea that somehow you need to accommodate lots of people after wars, or people that are leaving the jobs because they are no longer trusted if there is a regime change, the private sector, at least in some countries, seems to offer the ideal employment opportunities, because honestly, and this comes also from my interviews with some of the employees of these companies, they will always ask you, so, well, what can we do? You know, we have been fighting, or we've been on the police side, on the official police side for our career, this is what we know, so it's difficult for us to retrain to be suddenly, I don't know, teachers or doctors or whatever, and private sector employment seems to be ideal. Also, one experience that may be interesting to look into is in the Balkans, especially in Croatia and to a lesser extent in Bosnia, where lots of the even volunteers who were fighting, especially on the Croatian and Bosnian side, later found out employment in the private sector. They actually established much of the local private security companies, even though here some of the research indicates that there is also a problematic link that some of these companies may be actually just, let's say, officially registered mafia outfits, especially in Bosnia, which is due to the nature of the conflict, where the only people initially capable of fighting the other side were those who had access to guns, and this was essentially the people linked to the mafia in those countries. But again, it highlights the potential, both negative and positive, when it comes to security sector reform, disarmament, and demobilization. One important caveat that is supposed to be mentioned beyond private security, this was already mentioned also by Dr. Schneider, this is ideally a process that comes in what is called the post-conflict phase. And it's, in my opinion, the big question obviously is to what extent can we say that Ukraine is now in a post-conflict phase. And being here at a couple seminars before, I would say that Ukraine right now is at war, regardless of what different names may be used, and thus perhaps not the ideal timing for the discussion about disarmament, demobilization and reintegration. Nonetheless, what I would argue is that security sector reform and the topic of private security is important on its own, and while there is empirical evidence, which is this second slide, that it is very difficult to do security sector reform if there is an ongoing conflict, it is not impossible. So it's true that if you look at these countries, the closer you are to the war, which is from your perspective on the left side, the more negative examples you have, that is that the security sector reform has failed. The more you move to the post-conflict, the more successful examples we can find. But out of all these examples, in addition to the post-conflict dimension, the other key lesson is that the sooner you start, especially when it comes to the private sector, the better. And this is why I would argue that the private security is not just a challenge for security sector reform and disarmament, demobilization and reintegration. It's an important topic for any country, including Ukraine, precisely because it is something that challenges the traditional understanding of state and security as it most frequently presented. And again, just to show you some of the data, this is a worldwide problem or worldwide phenomenon. It's a big business. It's a big business that is also growing. So again, the idea that it's the states that are currently in charge of the provision of security does not really reflect the reality of both domestic security, that is essentially questions of law enforcement, which is the private security sector, but also militarily. I'm sure you heard about companies, I have some examples later, these especially from the US based companies and British based companies. I didn't select the most controversial, probably you heard about Blackwater. You can see that some of these companies boast on their web pages of having more generals than the entire US Army. Some research also suggests that the US Army would not be able to wage the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan without the reliance on such private military companies. There are also allegations, and I unfortunately do not speak either Russian or Ukrainian to be able to look too much into detail, that some of these companies are active in the current conflict in the east of Ukraine. So there is also the important military dimension. What I primarily want to talk or focus on is the what I would call regular criminal security or domestic security, which is also a big business. The first company that is listed here, G4S, as far as I could find out, is also the biggest private security company in Ukraine. So this is a multinational business with local dimensions, but again it highlights that it's an issue on its own. Why I think it's important on its own for Ukraine, this is again the data that I could find. Similarly, as in Czech Republic, you have a pretty substantial private security sector that also provides a lot of employment. We can then discuss whether it is the same as in Czech Republic, where the employment is very important because private security companies, even if they don't reintegrate combatants, frequently provide employment to people who are otherwise really difficult to employ. That is men in the 50s and 60s because there is relatively low need for qualifications, especially if you are the regular security guard. Because of this, the salary is also not very high and the turnover of the staff is, let's say, fairly substantial. This is why, again, if you link it to the question, for example, of the impact on private security clearances, this is quite important, because if private security companies indeed are part of the security sector and if they play sometimes even relatively high, let's say, national security functions, even though that depends on country to country, then definitely somehow they should be vetted, or we need to ensure that they are reliable partners of the security sector. As I already mentioned, perhaps the biggest problem that I could see in Ukraine are these private armies, which, as far as I could say, existed already before the Maidan events. So it's something that we inherited from the Yanukovych regime, but which continues to be an issue as of today. And the recent labels or the recent events, especially regarding the seizure of one of the state companies by one of the oligarchs from Dnipropetrovsk, show the potential again to disrupt the monopoly on the use of force by the Ukrainian state. So if we look at what these companies do and why are they important, I already mentioned some of the things. Private security essentially is about physical guarding. They do lots of cash transport services, security consultations, Also private detective investigations, which if we have more time or anyone is interested, we have lots of negative examples in the Czech Republic that I could go into, and how they also influence negatively even the very political competition in the Czech Republic. But in general, if we should summarize, the key challenge is that private sector is not easily compatible with the idea of security as a public good. So on political grounds, it challenges the idea that it's the state that's providing security to citizens. On economic grounds, it also challenges the idea about what are the appropriate expenditures, both at the state level. In Czech Republic, for example, the budget of the Ministry of Interior is roughly 60 billion crowns, which is divided by 20 if you want to in US dollars. But the private security sector generates another 20 billion crowns, which is roughly 1 billion US dollars annually. This then leads to charges by the critics about so-called commodification of security, that security is no longer a public good, but a good which is available to different people depending on how much money they have. That is, whether you can purchase security or not, which then creates also legal and normative challenges, because again, for private security companies, security is not what they are primarily concerned about. What they are concerned about is profit. And this can change. This can obviously raise a lot of dilemmas in the way how they provide security, both at the individual level and at the company level. So, moving to lessons learned from other countries, the key lesson is regulation and monitoring of the regulation is crucial. In this case, Czech Republic again is the worst case example. We still don't have a specific law for regulation of private security companies. The reasons why I could discuss later if anyone's interested, but most countries which have what I would call an integrated private security sector have very specific rules for private security companies, also at the military level for private military companies, both at the company level and for the level of the employees, that is the people who work for these companies. Most importantly, there are in this law some limits on private security activities. This essentially is about precisely the question of what is the core function of the state. What does it mean that the state has a monopoly on the use of force? And if we look especially in most of Western Europe, that means that private security employees are number one unarmed, and number two they don't have powers of arrest and seizure. So essentially the argument in most, at least Western European countries, is that private security companies should provide extra eyes and ears to the public police forces. That is essentially that they provide the extra personnel for preventative policing duties, but if anything serious happens or arrest or investigation is necessary, it is the job of the state police. This also ensures that these core functions are provided to all citizens, not just to someone who can pay. There are obviously some issues beyond this basic division on extra eyes and ears where there is an overlap. This is especially concerning so-called mass events or mass private property. Malls, shopping malls, stadiums, concerts, these events where it is essentially something that's a private event, but which is attended by a lot of people, and where usually security is these days provided by both private security and the state or the local police. So rules need to be worked out what exactly is the cooperation in such again mass events between private and public police forces. Another lesson that comes quite clear is that we need to make sure that essentially the citizens can distinguish who is private and public police. This comes both to the uniforms, but also, for example, in Czech Republic, a negative experience where some of the private security companies try to color their cars so that they look exactly the same as the national police. Especially for traffic accidents, because they were linked to insurance companies, and this is how they make money because they were there the first. So this is another thing that should be regulated to make sure that you can immediately see who is public and who is private if you are a citizen. The final note, which I already mentioned, private security employees should not be armed. In some countries it is allowed, especially when it comes to the transport of money, that guards are armed and for VIP protection, but otherwise in general for all other functions it is the idea that they should not be armed, and that again in legal terms they don't have any other powers than any other citizen for self-defense essentially purposes, so they don't have the powers, the extra powers when it comes to the public police forces. The next thing which is on the public side, because even the governments sometimes use the services of private security companies, there are two lessons. If the public sector is outsourcing, it should be really open contracts, and there should be competitive price bidding. Different countries have tried to come up with other types of cost expenditures for contracting. For example, the cost plus was what the US government has used in Iraq and in Afghanistan, when they essentially allow the private military companies to bill them whatever expenditures they get, and in addition to apply a 3% profit to all of these charges. This has led to massive overcharging, fraud, which is still today being investigated. So certainly a negative example not to be followed. The second point about public contracting, and this again we know also as a worst case example from the Czech Republic, is what is described in the literature of the revolving door phenomenon. And that is that essentially ex-police, especially high-ranking police or even ex-high-ranking generals or Ministry of Defense officials sort of flow into the private security contractors or private security companies. This allows them, number one, to secure public contracts, perhaps not in the ideal way, but also it leads again to the blurring of the idea of public and private security, because it's unclear where exactly this division begins, where it stops, if the same people who recently were in the public force are doing the calls in the private sector. So provisions to make sure that this does not happen, that for example, if you are a public police officer in some ranking, you cannot, once you retire, join a private sector for a couple of years, or that if you do, you have to pay a fairly substantial fee back to your public employer. These are some of the measures which have been suggested in other countries. The final point that I want to mention, obviously, if we talk about regulation, the question is who pays for it. There are some, I would say here, best case scenarios which suggest that the private sector can actually participate in covering the costs of regulation and monitoring. These are essentially the fees for registration on monthly basis, or when the fee is either installed or renewed, or this can be based on annual basis. This differs from country to country, but the bottom line is that it's not necessarily an extra expenditure on the public sector, something that can be also played if the regulations are written and shared at least with the private sector. I was trying to find out what is the situation in Ukraine when it comes to regulation. I could find out that you have some laws. I'm not sure how they are implemented or what real impact they have. So this is something that I want to ask you actually. But as far as I can see, unlike Czech Republic, there is at least something in legal terms in Ukraine. So we may be actually one step ahead in this regard than Czech Republic, but as with all laws, and this was already mentioned in the morning, implementation and then also monitoring of the provisions of the law really matters. So I would stop here again to summarize the basic point. Private sector is an important part of the security sector, either reform or non-reform, however you want to discuss it. It is also a problematic part because it challenges the idea of security as we know it, that is as a public good, and it challenges also the traditional understanding of a state as the only entity that has the monopoly on the use of force. And I see, at least from the distance, that these are some of the issues which are also really relevant both in the conflict setting, but even if we take the war that's currently ongoing outside in Ukraine, and that again there are some lessons that perhaps you can learn from both in a positive and negative way from other countries. As I mentioned, and I will stop here, I was focusing on the for-profit sector. There is also a lot that could be said about the non-profit sector. So private forces that contribute and help, especially the police forces on voluntary basis. There is lots of experience on this in Europe. I won't go into details, but there is this presentation by a colleague of mine which is precisely on this non-profit section in case you were interested. So this will be available to you. So thank you. Questions, comments, disagreements, very welcome.